unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Hello, this is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Rebecca Homkes, who is at London Business School, also at Duke Professional Education. Is that right?
That's correct.
And
yes.
and of course, is consultant and lecturer and the author of this book right here, Survive, Reset, Thrive: Leading Breakthrough Growth Strategy in Volatile Times. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. I'm pleased to be here.
Now, look, survive, reset, and thrive. This is the kind of stuff that every company is dealing with, right? And I think that this was inspired in part by the pandemic, because every company had to figure out, first of all, how to survive before they could do anything else. And I think you said right before the podcast, I think you said in the book, everyone wants to learn how to thrive, but you can't skip over the other stuff, right? If you're going to thrive, then you have to get the survive and the reset piece. But I think the other thing about this book is that it's really emphasizing the importance of uncertainty in the environment in which we operate. And a lot of business leaders, they know that there's a lot of uncertainty, and they think that their goal is to somehow reduce uncertainty. And of course, that's true in a way, right? I mean, it's all, if you're a venture capitalist, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a company, you're trying to reduce entropy, you're trying to, there's information gain in everything that you do strategically. But oftentimes the way they do it is to either pretend like it doesn't exist or to kind of walk away from it. And so, you know, what's the advantage of really surfacing uncertainty as one of the key things that leaders need to focus on?
Yeah, absolutely. If you think about uncertainty, we have lots of cliche guidance, grab uncertainty, the upside of uncertainty. But if you listen, Greg, to how we actually talk about it, leaders to leaders, exec to exec, we almost always put a word before it that means it's going to be bad. And I want you to listen to it, right? We ask each other, how are we going to manage uncertainty, reduce uncertainty, get through uncertainty? So we're actually framing our brains in day-to-day conversation that it's nasty and you've got to get through it. And it fundamentally, if you want to grow consistently and successfully through every market cycle, you've got to start by reframing, right? The definition of uncertainty is a series of future events which may or may not occur. Whether or not those events are good or bad depends on what we're trying to do and how we're set up. So if you see your role as doing that, figure out what we're trying to do and then get set up. Rather than reducing uncertainty, you just open the opportunity set to an order of magnitude more than others you're competing against.
Right, and you mentioned there's two types of uncertainty, right? There's the uncertainty that is just due to the randomness of the world and nature, and then there's the uncertainty that flows. It's like epistemic uncertainty. It's because you don't have the information that would enable you to better predict or better understand what's happening. And I think a lot of what you're suggesting is that leaders need to prioritize actions which will reduce the epistemic uncertainty, or at least, and then also be prepared so that when they do resolve that epistemic uncertainty, that they've already put in place the things that would enable them to respond to that new information.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we can't predict the future. And it sounds silly, but half of uncertainty is the emotional kind of concern, angst, tension because we can't. And the other one is the inability to make good decisions. And that inability to predict, we've actually put a lot of coping mechanisms into corporate planning. Lots of scenarios, lots of options, lots of different aspects, and a very, very, very long risk register right in the back of the strategy document. But as I ask every single company, where's the opportunity register in the appendix, right? We've got a long risk register that says all the things that could go bad, but we don't put a similar appendix that say all of the upside that could happen. And the first thing to fundamentally grasp is just stop trying to predict the future. Now, that's not being ignorant to what could happen, but dedicate that time to building a capability of making great decisions, even though we can't make great predictions. And that's where you actually start building differentiation.
So you're saying that people tend to focus too much on protecting against the downside as opposed to preparing to exploit the upside of the uncertainty?
Yeah, absolutely. And we know all of this, from the great work of Kahneman Jarofsky, right? As far as we want to protect everything that we have. And it goes back to that framing of uncertainty as negative or risk or something that we've got to manage through. We've made uncertainty a synonym of risk. And look, our traditional strategy tools don't always help on that. Most traditional strategy tools label it strategic plan, and it's the planning process, and the outcome is the plan. And I know this sounds silly, Greg, but words matter. So I'm going as far as to not call it the strategic plan, because when you label something a plan, I am now framed, it must happen. And I want to build in change from the very beginning, say that yes, this is, a guidance. We have now the direction/destination that we need, but I want to build into our brains from day one. This is going to adapt as we learn, and we're going to change along the way.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, in the startup world, we know, especially since the lean startup movement, that if anybody shows up with a business plan, right,
You laugh them out of the door, right? You laugh them out of the door. Yes.
Right? We laugh them out of the door.
Yeah,
We're like, come on, really? Like, what you need, if you're going to have a plan, it's going to be an experimentation, quote, plan. But why is it that people still use that language with mature companies? I mean, you hear it all the time. What's our strategic plan? What's our, roadmap? Right. And then what are our goals? And then we have like a checklist. How far along are we on these goals in the plan?
It's if you go back to the fundamental thing, I love this question, because somewhere along the way, we assumed when we got big, we learned everything we need to learn. Where when you're speaking in the startup world, I know we both wear that hat sometimes, you know fundamentally less than you don't know, right? And so part of those whole first days to weeks to months to years is learning velocity, because that's the ultimate differentiator. Like, when along the grow up phase as an organization did we somehow implicitly build in, we've learned all we need to learn, and now it's about building into a plan. And my push is, even if you had done that, which I don't think you have, you are now in an industry and a market that is changing all the time, and the variables are going to keep emerging as we're going. So that learning loop and that constant loop through. Look, lean startup, the OODA loop, the lean startup was roughly based on the OODA loop, which I'm sure was based on something and even longer ago military history than that. Greg, everything in growth is a loop, not a line. But we love checklists. We love linear plans because we feel progress. The challenge with a loop is you don't always feel the progress that you're making, even though you do. Whereas I give you a linear checklist, if I give you a set of OKRs to reach and you can check them off, you feel fulfilled at the end of the day. And that, gives us something that we need as leaders and managers. But we've got to walk away from that feeling. I've got to feel comfortable at the end of every day that I've achieved my linear checklist, and embrace this loop thinking and knowing that we're going to constantly be learning as we go through.
Well, no, I just got finished teaching my core strategy class about an hour ago. And oftentimes when you teach that core class, people ask, well, is this relevant for startups? Is there a different class? And we do have different classes, right? Entrepreneurship and so forth. But does it even make sense in today's world to think about strategy for mature companies versus strategy for young companies? I mean, it seems like the old idea of strategy was that you could somehow achieve some level of maturity where it was all about just defending, building a moat, protecting the rents that you're generating. And it's no longer about figuring out what you're doing. It's just about figuring out a way to keep doing what you're doing. I mean, is that obsolete in today's world?
I think we'd put a lot of our colleagues out of a job if we said that traditional strategy was obsolete, Greg. So we should probably stay away from that. But it's an it depends answer. And, I often get this question too, and people will come to the business school and they'll say, we don't want any of the old strategy tools. Can we just have the new strategy tools in our class? And you have to say, as venture capitalists, we still use Porter's 5 forces. Like, hate to tell you, but that one still has legs, right? As many of these others do. So the big thing about, if you think about Survive, Reset, Thrive, is that it's very applicable to startups. Many startups use it. What's very different is the cycle time. You have many more instances of Survive. You are resetting on a much faster clip. And I think a lot of startup founders are very clear and acknowledging that Thrive feels great, but we're probably going to go through another Survive soon, but we're heads up to it and prepared for it when we get there. Now, some things are a little bit different, but the majority of tools work. It's about their applicability, being able to apply them in the right way and adapting them. And then the cycle time, Greg, that's the main difference we're looking for.
Right. Now, let's walk through all three of these because, Survive, it sounds, I mean, if you're using the word survive, that usually comes to your attention when you are faced with some existential threat. So is the survive part of this trilogy something which is brought on by external events, or is survive something that you need to be thinking about all the time?
Yeah. So I'm going to do that terrible consultant answer and say both, right? Is survive is powerful language, as is reset. But good survive is proactive survive. Survive is explicitly not recession proofing, and it's proactive. So I have something I call steady state survive, and that's what you're aiming for. So you're always putting your organization in a place that you can be prepared for anything that can happen. So that's having strong cash flow. That's having low fixed costs. That's having clear communication lines across the organization, right? As much as possible, building these moats around your customer. Now, when you do that, you have less to do when a shock hits the system. You cannot stop shocks from hitting you. Now, shocks can be external, macro events, war, surprise election results, pandemic, recession. They can be internal. Losing a major investor, losing a major customer, a major regulation hurting one of your main product lines. When those happen, you've got to go into survive phase. But if you've been doing your steady state survive, then you have less to do. And I like to split survive into two aspects, the basics and the power moves. Now, most of us who have run a company know the basics, and I simplify that by calling them the 4 C's. Cash, cost, customers, communication. This is a place you can build a checklist, if you will, say, this is the minimum we should ever go on these. Pull it out when you hit that shock. Make sure you're ready to go. But Greg, if you just do the basics, you're going to get stuck there. And I saw this a little bit in 2009. I saw this big time in 2020, as I'm sure you did too. A lot of boards were putting in place a recession playbook, right? When we actually had this very unknown opportunity set emerging, and they were keeping their organization cycling through these basics, the 4 C's, and not using any of the power moves and fundamentally not moving out. So survive should definitely be the most time-based of the 3 modes. Occasionally you need much longer, but your goal should be to get those basics in place, utilize some power moves, and then move on to the reset. And one of my favorite moves is called repurposing and partnering. And what you do there is you look at every single asset in your company. It could be a physical asset, a digital asset, a people asset, and ask one question. Can this asset add the same amount of value to the business now as it could before the shock? If not, who or what could it add value for? And then across your ecosystem or within your company, repurpose that asset. And then the ultimate power move, though, is learning velocity. I'm sure you've seen this too, but whenever shocks hit organizations, public sector or private sector, we won't air dirty laundry about our universities, right? They tend to go very heads down, right? And stop learning and go into detailed tracking. And there is never a better time to learn than during a shock. And so your ultimate power move is learning faster than others during this phase, and then you will move out of survive faster than others.
Yeah, I like this dichotomy between heads down and heads up. And it's kind of, I saw that and I was like, wait, I can't believe I've never heard anybody use that dichotomy before, because it's so powerful, right? The idea of keeping your head up, right, and aware and perceptive and ready to learn, rather than just like, oh, I just gotta work hard and execute on this.
And think about the weekly meetings during a shock, right, or during a downturn. It is about tracking. It is about the very, very micro metrics. It is very much, what did you do? What do you need to do? Add the line. What did we learn last week? What do we need to learn this week? And if you just that little switch, adding those 2 points into that weekly huddle, you'll be amazed at how much difference there is. But I'll repeat, there is no better time to learn. Your customers will never be more honest about what they really need for you. Your vendors will never be clear about what a partner has to deliver. Your employees will never be more honest about what they need from their employer, right? These times are the best times to learn. Lean into them.
Well, you also have this other dichotomy, which is prepare stances versus act stances. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, the big thing about becoming, transitioning to thrive, which I absolutely promise we will get to, is using every option set you have. And if you build a basic decision tree, right, so we're going to kind of go back to school for a bit. You build a basic decision tree. At any point in time in strategy, you have 2 options. You can wait and prepare, or you can act. And when you're preparing, you've got 3 options. You can be analyzing the environment, you can be watching the environment, or you can be active watching, so what I call waiting to pounce. Now, we all know in traditional strategy, the waiting and analyzing. That's the traditional big consultancy approach, right? Lots of analysis, lots of research reports. And frankly, on AI, I'm still seeing a lot of waiting and watching. We're just kind of watching, don't really know where to play, don't have any idea of how to win. But active watching is really cool stance, right? Because you're saying, I'm going to explicitly let someone else move first and learn, but I am building capability to move after that. And then you have acting stances. You can act for results, you can act to shape, or you can act to learn. Most companies, so there's 6 stances, most companies do 2. They act and analyze, and then, they act for results after waiting to analyze. And think about all of the options you're leaving on the table. 2 of the most powerful things you can do is act to shape, where based on your beliefs, you say, the world is going this way. If we build our industry or our market in this way instead, we will be set up to be favored in that. That could be regulation and lobbying. That could be spending to set the market up, such as an Uber did. It could be influencing in different ways, but it's a really powerful stance. And I'll give you a quick example. One of my favorite recent ones is actually from Airbnb. Is after the pandemic, as I'm sure you know, Greg, Airbnb went to 100% virtual. You can live anywhere, you can work anywhere. Now, in doing that, they realized this is actually really hard. There's a big reason a lot of companies don't do this, because every country has different employment laws, different maternity leave, different vacation days, and they navigated this really complicated web of different national laws. And you know what they did in the end when they learned all of this? They public sourced it. They gave it to the world. And you think, well, why would you give that away? Like, you would just spend all of these months learning something that now is to your advantage. Because I'm acting to shape. This is hard, so other companies won't do it. If we make it easier for other companies to do, more companies will, right? And then more people will live and work in Airbnbs all around the world. But your most powerful stance is acting to learn. You are doing purposeful, sometimes resource action just to learn, not to get immediate results, but to get results over the midterm. So the pushes open up all of those stances so you can take of opportunity of everything that you've got.
Yeah, look, I think most people would say that they want their organizations to be learning organizations. But just saying that is not enough. And there's a couple different ways to learn. And I like this dichotomy you have between sort of the more conventional way, which is to learn, think, act, right? Where learning is somewhat passive, to act, learn, think. So why is it that people don't do it that way? I mean, is it because we associate the acting part with heavy investment, higher probability of failure, unrecoverable expenditures, that sort of thing?
Is it all of the above? Most organizations, if you say learning is important, will look you straight in the eye and say they are learning organizations. And my push is you are a teaching organization, not a learning organization. So you invest time into webinars, conferences, executive education, all great things. But that is teaching, not learning.
Good for us.
Yeah, and keep going to all of those executive education courses, especially it's the
yes,
right.
Definitely.
But that is not being a learning organization. So it's part of that. It's because we associate acting with resourced, and you can do a lot of actions to learn that aren't resourced. We have forgotten somehow along the way that there are a lot of what I call no regret moves. And we don't look for them after a certain point, right? And so a no regret move is a move that you take that you say, even if our beliefs are wrong, I would not regret making this move. And if you think about this constant learning loop of I execute, I get an insight, I embed it in the organization, differentiation is fundamentally about moving through that loop faster than others. But we have framed that, and I think comfortable versus uncomfortable is a big reason, Greg. We don't like to act before we feel like we know. And as the world around us is changing, we have to take actions based on beliefs before we're waiting for facts, which comes from acting and then getting the insight, embedding it, refining, and then going and acting again. So it's still a loop. But I'm saying put a different center of gravity on a different part of the loop, because we've got to be constantly learning again and faster than others.
Yeah, I mean, in our business school, we typically start with a data and decisions course, and I used to teach that course, and it's weird because we talk about hypothesis testing as if we are scientists developing a drug, and we say, oh yeah, you gotta have a p-value below 0.05 before you can conclude that something is true. But I mean, in business, if you wait until you have that level of certainty before you do anything, I mean, you're not going to do anything, right? Like you're just gonna sit there, and by the time you figure it out, by the time it becomes relatively certain, you're probably going to be the last mover. You're going to be someone's going to beat you to it. So why? I mean,
and that's
it's almost completely inappropriate that we teach that, right?
Yeah, look, I think there's a discipline to growth, and that's something that a lot of organizations don't have the patience to build. And part of that discipline is understanding how to make very clear hypotheses, how to do this acting to learn. But you've got to push beyond. And I say it as simply as that. If you wait to act for until it's a fact, there's no longer an insight. Everybody has it, right? If you actually want to go on a growth journey, and definitely if you want to go on a breakthrough growth journey, you're going to have to make movements based on beliefs, but you're not acting in blind faith or you're not ignoring the world around you. You are resourcing as you're testing it and learning and affirming your beliefs. And all of this is about parallel pathing, right? So we're going to borrow from product development. So think I have set my beliefs, I have determined what I don't know, I have broken down my individual assumptions to vet and test. And then while I'm executing my priorities, I am parallel pathing, testing my beliefs. And as I learn and affirm, I build in more resourcing. As I don't, I pause. And then occasionally, of course, I change. But we've got to, again, break this linear thinking about set plan, resource plan, execute plan, and embrace this loop thinking where I am resourcing as I'm learning and going forward.
Right. So you say we act on beliefs, not facts.
Yes.
And then you say, let's figure out what kind of questions we can ask to find out if our beliefs are valid. And so what would have to be true in order for those beliefs to make sense? I mean, but it seems like a lot of companies, yes, they do act on beliefs, but their beliefs are almost, I don't know, they're sticky, like you said. They people, once they lay the beliefs, convert the beliefs into a plan, then they forget that the plan was built on just a guess or a contingent belief. So why is that? I mean, if our concern is that, oh gosh, we don't want to make this irreversible investments, then why do we then go ahead and do this? Why do we go ahead and keep pushing good money after bad rather than trying to figure out how to adjust on the fly?
The corporate world recognizes and rewards managers who stick to plan. I'm going to repeat that. The corporate world recognizes and rewards managers who stick to plan, right? And or who get back on plan. And that language has actually been the real downfall of being able to act, learn, and adapt much faster than others. The other is, it's not laziness, that's probably an unfair word, but it's lack of discipline. Is that after we've gone through all of the work of the strategy, what do we communicate? The so what? The what are the priorities we're going to be executing? We don't communicate the beliefs that led to those choices. And that's another micro switch you can make, which make a big difference in execution, is as a leadership team, when you're communicating the strategy, you're saying, these are our beliefs. These are the top 8 to 10 beliefs we have about how the industry, market, customers, us are going to be changing. Based on these beliefs, this is what we're doing. These are our top 5 priorities. But I'm calling out right now, if and when these beliefs get challenged, we might change one of those priorities. Now, what happens in most organizations is you just communicate the priorities. And then what happens when the situation changes? You don't want to be the leadership team that's seen as fickle or changing too quickly. And you feel like you've already done all the hard work of communicating the strategy. Who wants to change? So that change, Greg, I know it sounds simple saying it out loud, makes a massive difference because 2 really, really powerful things happen when you communicate beliefs before the choices. 1, you've given yourself permission to change, and that is critical permission you need from the organization. 2, you have recruited more testers because as soon as you've communicated to the wider management team, these are our beliefs, you now have recruited dozens, if not hundreds of people around the organization who are also heads up looking for those beliefs. So it's a very powerful adjustment. And the second thing, and this is going to sound sillier, is never crystallize the strategy because it's based on guesses. Let's just call it what it is. The unverified beliefs are guesses, and that's okay. We have no other choice. We've got to start making decisions based on these. But once we form it into a pretty plan, we don't want to change it. So one little thing I ask for companies is never label it strategy final, all caps, right? Because we do that and then we print a pretty poster on the wall and we feel like we must get it done. It was April 2020 and I had multiple boards of big companies the name of, when we're talking about what we have to do now, say, but Rebecca, we already printed the posters. The strategy's already on the wall. What are you saying? We have to change it now. So never make it to the point where you think you can't change it. And so that thing, I know sounds silly, has been super helpful for a lot of organizations. Always make it messy enough you got the permission to change.
Well, I mean, is that leadership style, does that flow from the discomfort that people have with uncertainty. I mean, in other words, I've always wondered why it is that we continue to see overconfident leaders. And it may well be that that's because that's what people want, right? I mean, if you are leading the troops into battle and you say, well, we're going to do this attack because we believe that this is where the enemy is, but we could be wrong. Like, wait, what a second. This guy wants me to go and do this, and he's only like 60% confident that, is it that the kind of, what we think of as leadership, we associate that with clarity of vision as opposed to this more humble, probabilistic style of direction setting?
Yeah, I think we do, Craig. And the weird kind of paradox about uncertainty, and you've seen this in teams that you've worked with, is the more uncertainty team members face, the more they beg their leaders for alignment, right? The more uncertainty we're facing, the more we look to our leadership team and say, tell me where we're going and how, right? And that's exactly the time that we can't provide that alignment. So, one option is what I call delusion, is to just say, I've got this, right? And take them forward. And another is this incremental approach where you say, I can't give you a precise destination, but I can give you the direction that we're going in. And as we're going in this direction, I'm going to keep updating you as we learn and as we can crystallize more. And so free yourself from the notion that a leader must always provide a precise destination, and embrace that as all I need to give the team is a direction and confidence that I'm going to keep learning and communicating as we go. And it's a kind of a simple metaphor, but think of the difference between if we're going on a trip together, me saying, we're heading exit 405 for Santa Monica, or Greg, we're going northwest. Do I have my Google Maps set to a very precise destination, or am I taking out my compass and going in a direction? And directions are okay. And the direction gives the team the alignment they need from leadership while preventing you from falling into that delusion trap that you've got it. Because as soon as you've communicated a firm message, you will also be less heads up to looking for any information that might go against it. You are now framed, and you are almost subconsciously often, right? It's putting on those blinders saying, as different information's coming in, we sometimes don't look at it if we've been very firm in the position that we've communicated.
Now, I like this idea of recruiting the people on the team to be heads up, but it's kind of pointless if the new information that they acquire doesn't make its way back to the direction setter, right? So there has to be some channel by which the new information is gathered up. I mean, if you have a conscious policy of experimentation, then presumably you have those channels. But if it's highly decentralized, I mean, you talked about these leaders. What was the term that you used for these leaders, like the embedded leaders, or what was the term?
Distributed leaders. Distributed leaders. Yeah. Your key managers and leaders distributed across the organization, critical for execution. Yeah.
Right. And so they're also kind of sources of intelligence, and they're sort of the beacons for the top leadership, right?
They're sources of intelligence if you have a way to gather their information intelligence and embed it and then use it going forward. And this is where AI can actually help us do this in ways that we couldn't do before. And what I encourage organizations to do is to build what's called a beliefs tracker. We all have strategy trackers, which tell us whether or not we're executing the strategy. Build a belief tracker as well, where these are our top 10 to 15 beliefs. Here's the belief, and then is the belief tracking, and then what's the information that's coming in. And you want it semi-structured, but the more informal and the less cumbersome this tracker is, literally the most successful ones, and these are big companies, are a shared Google Drive or a SharePoint Excel. They're software forward as well, but you want it easy enough to use, people will. Now, the big difference between a belief tracker and a strategy tracker is I want my belief tracker off track sometimes. And you ask, well, why, Rebecca? Because if a belief tracker is always green, my first assumption is not that we're great predictors. My first assumption is we weren't clear enough on our beliefs to be able that the information coming in is allowing us to verify or not. So having
or
the
beliefs
separate
were,
tracker.
Or the beliefs were so general and high level.
So
that they don't
generic,
really provide,
so high level that, a good belief has to be something you can get wrong. And that's a test. Once you write your beliefs down, I look back at it. There's no way you can get it wrong. You've written down a truism. You're not going to be making strategic choices based on that. So yes, build a way to gather the information, simple, and informal as possible, and then have a belief tracker that you keep going into. And then when you sit down to review the strategy, that's your first question. Not are we on track to plan? Your first question is, has the situation changed, right? Because if the situation's changed, being on track to plan may or may not be a good thing. But much more importantly, that's what you're talking about as a leadership team. Given the changed situation, what, if anything, should we be doing instead?
Yeah, I think it was Jeff Bezos who said that if you know ahead of time the results of the experiment, then it's not an experiment. Right?
Yes.
And so you have a lot to say about experimentation.
I do. Yes.
Yeah, and I found interesting is that you say it's not about designing better experiments. It's about having more experiments. I mean, obviously you can't. I mean, better is better than not better. But if you have a trade-off between a small number of experiments that you think are better, I mean, you can't always know ahead of time whether they're better. So how do you operationalize this idea of mass experimentation or increasing the number of experiments?
You want to be running more experiments faster and cheaper than everybody else. And what we have done inside organizations is we have romanticized being a tech company. And so we are optimizing for celebrating failure rather than building the very difficult capability to build of learning velocity. And that's the first thing, right? Move from we're chasing the wrong symptoms versus causes in a lot of these lessons that we're trying to pull in from tech companies. And that's the one that probably frustrates me the most, right? It's not about celebrating failure. It's about building a capability of learning. And one of the ultimate things to do that, Greg, is get great at identifying individual assumptions. So a pilot is not an experiment. And we've made pilot and experiment synonymous. A good experiment tests one assumption at a time. Because if you try to design the perfect experiment, you're actually usually putting too many variables in because you're catering for too many people who want something there. And then whether or not it works or not, if I've got 6 variables in there, I've actually learned nothing. I've just wasted resources. So a good experiment is testing one assumption at a time. And what I'm looking for is what's called the root variable. And it's similar to root cause in lean management, is really tease down what is that ultimate root assumption or root variable that if this isn't true, the whole thing blows up. Verify that. Then go to the next one. If this isn't true, the whole thing doesn't work. And if you build that discipline, you will be running faster and cheaper than everybody else. And some of this is time. The time cycles, and I think some leadership teams in more what we would consider stable or commoditized industries are not waking up to cycle time is even shifting in theirs, right? So if you used to be able to run an experiment in 3 months, it should be 3 weeks now or 3 days. And so the phrase I like to use, Greg, is you had $2,000 in 2 weeks, what would you do? Right. And in some industries, a little bit more, a little bit less. But that thought experiment's really powerful because we're used to thinking I've got months and resources as long as I put together the right pretty PowerPoint decks. But just ask a leader, yes, but if you only had 2 weeks and $2,000, what would you do instead? And every time I ask that, after a bit of a pause, a CEO will say, we'll just rattle it off like they know what to do. They've just never been forced to think with that amount of time and resource constraint. And that's the thinking that we want to happen.
And you also said it's important to find your New Zealand. Now, was it Google that did that? Who is it?
Yes, that's one of my favorite examples. I mean, it's Facebook. Facebook now, of course, it's called Meta, but that was back in Facebook's days. So it's all about defining good experiments. So as a quick pause point, you cannot do this unless you define what an experiment is at your company, and it's going to look a little bit different for every company. And those variables are about time to learn and cost and risk and culture protection. But developing a template, and without that, you cannot do this, right? So what are the 4 or 5 things that define a good experiment? Now, one of the things that Facebook did in the early days is they mapped all of the connections across the world. And what they learned was that their customer in New Zealand was very representative of their ideal customer, but very not connected. So if you were a Kiwi on Facebook, most of your connections were also in New Zealand, which means that every single thing you saw on Facebook from the late teens, right, was done in New Zealand first. Why? If it worked, great. We roll it out to the next set of countries. If it doesn't, no problem, right? Very, very mitigated risk. And so if you start talking about experimentation with a non-tech or software company, they usually do the hands in the air. Oh, Rebecca, we can't experiment like those guys because we're not a tech company. We can't experiment on 1% of our customers. We have, 200 customers. Find your New Zealand. You always have a New Zealand. And I also call it an island test. So an island test means, we can run this experiment, like that's what New Zealand is, and it's going to be held within that. If it works, great, we can go to the next one. If not, it's within the island. And even the biggest companies with the smallest group of customers, let's say you only sell to the big box retailers, you will have a product line you can run an island test on. I'm working on some right now. And so find your New Zealand. If you're not big enough, you can do 1%. And that's, again, a powerful one. Now, there's a few instances, Greg, where you don't have a New Zealand because you're working on something highly regulated or sensitive. And then I say your third option is recruit a learning partner. Stop thinking of your customers as transactional vehicles and instead recruit some learning partners. You find them and say, you want to grow, I want to grow. You willing to test and learn with me? And they will say yes, and they will love saying yes, and that will build even stronger moats about that relationship. So if you don't find a New Zealand, which is very rare, then go out there and recruit a learning partner.
Yeah, I mean, startups do this, right? I mean, one of the
as part of their DNA, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most important decisions is who's going to be your beachhead customer. And I
Yes.
think a big part of that is, who can you enlist to provide you with continuous feedback so you can just keep trying out different things on them, and they're not going to mind it. I mean, most people, I know this when I do, if I say this in class, if I ever tell my class, oh, by the way, I'm trying this out. This is an experiment. I'm going to try it out on you guys. Everyone's like, wait, what? We don't want to be subjects, right? So you got to find a customer who wants to be a subject, one that has a vested interest in your success and helping you to,
Exactly.
in other words, if you disappear, it's going to be a disappointment to them because you are providing them with something of value, or at least you have the possibility of providing them with something of value. So this kind of expands your discovery surface in a way.
And you've got these options, right? So it's you've got to move away from the we can't do this because we're not X and say, okay, if you're not large enough to do a percentage of, find a New Zealand. If you're not large enough for that, recruit a learning partner. And then you can get going on some of these things that we're talking about, because learning velocity is so critical. It sounds cliche, but that is the ultimate differentiator. Companies that learn faster grow faster. And that's in every single stage. That's in the survive phase, that's in the reset phase, and that's fundamentally what's going to keep you in the thrive phase, is that you're learning faster than everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Now let's get back to the reset phase. I know we're doing this a little bit out of order.
That's
but
okay.
You talked about must-win battles.
Yes.
And this is a theme that you come back to over and over again. I mean, a lot of what you're talking about is prioritization. It's about understanding what's important, what isn't, and with your limited resources, how do you get the most value out of what it is that you're working on? What's a must-win battle, and how do we identify it?
It's the critical output of the reset phase. And we've got to say reset means change. And the word reset, even going into that, puts pause on people before they get to the must-win battle part, because they say, and I know it sounds silly, Greg, but I get a lot. People will say to me, we love SRT, we want to go through this process, we need must-win battles, but can we not use the word reset? Because my board doesn't want to change too much. It scares my team a bit. And they try to change the word reset to refine or reframe or re-glance over. And it's like, you've got to put the word in there to say that list of things we were doing before the shock, it might be a different list after that. Second, the typical kind of strategy planning process starts with, we go in a room, there's a flip chart in the front of the room, or a virtual whiteboard if we're a virtual team. And we say, okay, everyone go write what they think the top 3 priorities are. We all go the thing. We've got little sticky notes. We vote, and then we kind of do this thing. If you start with that question, you will get the list wrong. The must-win battles are the very final step of the reset. And if you go through the other steps, you've set your beliefs, you've defined success, the other pieces, then those things just fall out. And this is critically it. Now, terminology matters, but I'm not saying every company should change the word. If you got a word that works, great, use it. Just make sure the word has integrity. And that's why I started using the term must-win battles, to get away from the nonsense language of, priorities, pillars, goals, OKRs, KPIs, aims, targets. I could go on and on, right? Then how do I know what's really most important? This ruthless prioritization of only a few things are going to truly create value over the next few years. Midterm is a sweet spot, around 3 years. Cross-functional team, department, or unit. You can see how they increase client willingness to pay or fundamentally decrease cost, or sometimes addressing a big major challenge has to become a must-win battle. So they are your midterm, value creating priorities that make it very clear to people across the organization what we're going to do, but just as critically, what we're not going to do.
Well, I mean, people can get reset fatigue, right? I mean, if you're constantly, we talk about how all management is change management. And if that's true, then you are constantly in flux. You never really get a chance to settle in or sink in. You know, people want to have rinse, wash, repeat. And here, if you're resetting all the time, then you never actually get a chance to feel that sense of flow, right, through repetition. I mean, is there a cadence, an optimal cadence to the kind of SRT cycle? Is it endogenous? I mean, can you decide this, or are you really more or less at the mercy of the cadence of the shocks?
It is almost always controllable. They're going to get macro shocks that you can't control the timing of. But if you've done your steady state survive, you've got a lot less time in that stance. And I love that question because I agree with you completely. You know, these constant big shifts we've again wrongly used the word pivot in, the real world, another improperly thing borrowed from tech companies, it is fatiguing to the organization. And that fatigue leads to burnout, leads to you losing your best that fatigue leads to burnout means you're losing your best employees. The best pivots or changes are not these big, massive, we're doing A and now we're going to doing B. It's, Greg, about these small micro changes and micro adjustments as we're learning, and not necessarily tactical, right? But these micro changes and adjustments. This was one of my must-win battles. I'm going to kind of shift, of these two sub things I'm resourcing, I'm going to go from one to the other. And I'm doing that because I've got my belief tracker up. Even in big macro events like COVID or Brexit or a few other, companies that were doing this process maybe changed one, max two must-win battles, right? You would actually be surprised if you've done the robustness of the reset process through the beliefs and the other elements. There isn't necessarily always big changes that have to happen, but you feel more confident in those changes that you did. So I'm absolutely not advocating for big, massive changes all the time or telling the company that you are. You're just being heads up that this thing is adaptable. We're going to make micro shifts as we learn. And if and when we need to, we're going to take something off the list to give ourselves room to put something else back on the list that's going to be a bigger growth priority. So change, yes. Constant change to the point of just emotional fatigue? Absolutely not. We've got to be more clear about this, I think, when we speak to managers and leaders about what change is. Yes, it's all about change management. But if we make change this big beast, right, we're not going to do the small parts of it which truly make the difference.
Well, does that mean that, some people think that strategy is really the domain of the organizational pinnacle, right? It's something that happens at the top. But can you, as somebody who is lower down in the organization, utilize these tools within your much smaller domain?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So these teams, and for anything, some of the survive steps, the reset questions are the principles of being thrive, using the beliefs and the learning velocity can be done at a team, function, or unit level. Now, is it better if the whole organization is using, similar language and moving together? Of course, like any other thing. But many people have used this just within their domain, and you will still see the difference even within your micro area of influence.
So this is like a BYOD tool, right? So you can just bring it in and force the people up top to pay attention. There was one, you have a bunch of great stories in the book, and one of them I remember, it was this, I guess it was like a footwear company during COVID, and they had
this Brooks belief. Running. Yes, Brooks Running. Yes, they're actually one of the a Berkshire Hathaway company. Yes.
Yeah, and they had this belief that people are going to keep running during COVID. But this is something that you could probably test, and you could probably get some early pieces of information that will tell you whether you're on the right track. And so now what did they do? They just sent a bunch of people out into the field to count the number of people who are running?
Old school field marketing, right? So COVID happens, supply chain shuts down, manufacturing shuts down, retail shuts down. And as much as we think we lived in a digital commerce world, a lot of, running and kind of high-end athletic apparel was still bought in retail outlets. And the head of Brooks Running and his team had a hypothesis, a strong one, that in downturns or shocks, people shift to running, right? Because it's more economical than high-end gyms. It is a stress relief, right? And it can be done kind of within your community. So to test this belief, they already had a community of people in the field that would do, test their new things like that. So they sent this community to the local parks, between 4 and 6 every day, and just think of somebody standing there like a bouncer in a club, just counting the runners. And at the end of the day, they would send their numbers in, and they saw the numbers be ticking up and ticking up dramatically and then holding. And because of this insight, they turned their supply chain on, I think about 6 weeks before anybody else did. And through that, they hit the $1 billion mark the year after COVID before predicted, right? And took significant share from some of the big guys. And this was just one example of things they were doing to test and act to learn during that time.
But look, I mean, all of these companies presumably have big data strategies, and they probably have all sorts of data streams that they can tap into. Why weren't they able to pick up on this? I mean, why? I think a lot of companies put a lot of faith into these more sophisticated data gathering channels.
It's not necessarily an or, it's sometimes an and, right? But we also have to remember, and this is the warning I give people about LLMs too, is that a lot of that is based on historical data, right? We didn't have a frame for spring, summer of 2020 because we had never had, the last time we had a global pandemic was the Spanish flu, and that was way before your and I time, Greg, right? So our data systems are based on predictions, based on historical trends, right? Now, and some of those are useful, right? But a lot of them are not. And even though they applied that hypothesis Brooks Running did from 0809, a lot of companies put in their 09 playbook in 2020 and it did not work, right? Because they had data on how to act in a recession, not extreme uncertainty. And think about everything's triangulating in. If you are lucky enough to have a data science team to be sitting on these resources, use it. But you're triangulating in on that with active testing of the beliefs versus, frankly, just the anecdotal conversations that you're having with customers, suppliers, and vendors. And the companies that do the best pull in, and then they structure the inputs from these different sources rather than over-structuring just the data source. And I think that's the real difference you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Now, you had another wonderful quote in here, which is, agility without strategy is chaos. And of course, agility is something that you're a big fan of. I mean, it's part of this. I'd never seen this other acronym, which is the BLAST. Okay. We kind of touched on some of it, but the A in BLAST is agility. And everyone talks about agility. But what would it be like to have agility without strategy?
Yes. So BLAST is a framework that I came up with actually before COVID. And what I was trying to do is really codify what sets high performing companies apart beyond the truisms. Because if you look for that question, it's the same vague generic crap, right? It's great team, great strategy, great execution, great culture. It's like, yeah, I can give you dozens and dozens of companies that claim they have that. They're not consistently, successfully high performing. So I wanted to dig down 2, 3, 4 layers and say what really sets them apart. And it's those. They act on beliefs, not facts. They learn faster than others. They've got agility decision making. They build shared context and trust. And agility is in the middle. I mean, that's the best acronym, but also because you need the piece on both sides to do it. But what I hear often, and I'm sure you've heard something similar, is, strategy is great, but we're not going to do strategy this year because we want to be more agile. And you have to pause and smile and say, the definition of agility is making good decisions quickly aligned with strategy. Lacking a strategy, you cannot have agility. You have speed, but it's not aligned speed. And that's the key words you're looking for, Greg, is aligned speed. Alignment without speed is too slow to matter. Speed without alignment is chaotic. You're building aligned speed, which comes from the true definition of agility, making good decisions quickly aligned with strategy. But you can't do that lacking a value creating strategy because then I don't know what's most important and why. And I might be making great decisions and you're making decisions. But if they're not aligned with each other, we're not rowing in the same direction as an organization.
Now, if you spend time at business schools and you teach business school students, I mean, what do you think they need to learn that they're maybe not learning enough of? I mean, if our job as business school teachers is to create more impactful people who can go into these organizations and make them more effective, what's the kind of missing ingredient? Is it more about their dispositions? Is it more about their skills? What is it that we need to convey to them to help them become more effective?
I mean, I love this question. I think a big one is, and it's going to sound theoretical, so we'll make it practical, is moving from linear thinking to loop thinking. At business schools, and we don't have a choice, it's simply structure and diaries of professors and everything else. We make things seem almost linear. You have strategy, you have finance, you have accounting, you have marketing, and we even build out these frameworks that say you must have X course before Y, you must have Y course before Z. And again, we need to do something like that because business school professors are very hard groups of people to mangle, right? We've got to put a structure so we're in the right place at the right time for the students. But that's almost framing that that's how the world works. And it's not a linear world, it's a loop-based world, which means I'm pulling little bits from everything else. Is that how high performing organizations work? Is not leadership and then strategy and then culture and then operations. All of these things are living and executing together. So one, move from linear thinking to loop thinking. Leave behind the comfortability that I can build a checklist and be done with any of these things. You will never be done. And then second, acknowledge that you're going to be pulling bits and pieces from all of these disciplines on a day-to-day basis. Therefore, you must make everything as simple and practical as possible. And that's part of what I was trying to do with Survive, Reset, Thrive is I pulled in lots of my favorites, right? You're going to see Jobs to be Done from Christensen. You're going to see the VRIN framework because I use these things every single day, but I'm trying to express them in language that's very simple and, your every day-to-day manager who might not have an MBA can use. So loop to line, and they are not disciplines. They come together. It's bits and pieces, which actually sets apart performance.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of strategy as sort of an integration function. And, the way I teach strategy, I just was saying that this morning, I could teach these cases in any order. I can't do that in my data and decisions class.
Yes.
I have to start with distributions,
Yes.
and work my way up to hypothesis testing, and then go to linear, multiple regression. But with strategy, it's like, the first case could have been the last case because there's no.
Yes.
You're not working up to anything. It's all a big. It's all a big mess. But does that mean then
that lens of value creation is always there, right? That lens of value creation is always there. We're just telling different stories to show all of these different ways that you can create it across different business models and operating models.
So then to be a good strategist, I mean, it seems like you not only have to be familiar with all these different disciplines, but you also have to, as you say, have a kind of a library of frameworks. And you have to be willing to discard a framework and substitute in another framework on the fly if it illustrates or illuminates something more insightful, right?
Absolutely. And there's some frameworks that I think are less helpful when you're facing extreme levels of uncertainty. Every framework has its time that it was very useful, but let's look at one like balanced scorecard. Growth is fundamentally unbalanced. Saying to an organization you should allocate resource across these 4 buckets in roughly the same way every cycle is not how I'm seeing the world working. Growth is fundamentally unbalanced. Anything that makes a long list of things without prioritization, you're not helping the organization. So again, there's some frameworks that have their time and move on. Nothing is timeless, right? But some things are more lasting than others if you adapt them. Porter's 5 Forces is a great example. I still use it on an almost day-to-day basis. But how buyers get power has changed and fundamentally changing more with social media. How suppliers get power or not is changing. The ways you can enter a market has fundamentally changed in the last 5 years, let alone the last 15. So it's about knowing that these things are lasting but not timeless. And if you keep updating and adapting them, they're still going to be useful tools.
So if organizations need to increase this kind of cycle time of learning, does that mean that all of the people who work in these organizations also have to increase the cycle time of their learning, or is this can it be done through organizational learning? In other words, does every individual have to also exhibit these traits, and is there kind of a limit to how much any individual can do this? We talked about the problem of continuous change in an organization. I mean, there's got to be limits to what individuals can put up with, and how can they best make themselves capable of this continuous learning?
There's limits to what any individual can do in a period of time, right? And not trying to anchor back to strategy with 2 strategy professors, but clarity of value creating strategy from the reset helps, because if you can tie all of these capabilities you're trying to build to that, it sounds like I'm being overly simplistic, but that helps a lot. But yes, you do need the wider organization embracing beliefs that come before choices. You need the wider organization embracing learning. You need the organization understanding we're aiming for aligned speed, so helping to make better decisions faster. You need to build a shared understanding of the strategy, otherwise people will struggle to make those decisions, and then it's about trust. So it's a yes, but, which I know you're not allowed to say. Yes, but it's not all at one time. You chunk it out, and if you start with that value creating strategy, you've got that anchor, almost that center of gravity you can keep cycling all of these choices through. But the bad news is this is hard work. Like, a lot of leaders are absolutely committed to growing in the market, but I find significantly less committed to building the discipline of growth, right? Growth is a discipline. It is not a given. And you've got to dedicate the time to building this discipline and capability of growth, which are these capabilities we just went through, the beliefs, learning, agility, et cetera, is both matter. And I'm finding, just repeating, Greg, more and more organizations are becoming obsessed with growth again, but they don't want to spend the time on the discipline side. And then this growth is going to be very fleeting and not that consistent breakthrough growth that we're aiming for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I sometimes like to say that the CEO now stands for Chief Experiment Officer, but
Yes.
but it sounds like, right, we could fill in a couple different
Yes.
words in that middle there. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me. This is great. The book is called Survive, Reset, and Thrive, and we barely scratched the surface. It's got lots of valuable content in here, and recommend it to strategic leaders of both startups and mature companies. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Greg. It was my pleasure to be here.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.